You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host. As always, this week we're moving away from the building innovation and policy side and just getting back to the market, because I know we don't want to leave it too long before having a chat about market dynamics, what's going on the streets, at our home opens on the weekends. And one of the most dynamic real estate agents in Western Australia that I know these days, he's actually not even a Western Australian, which is a bit awkward, is James Peach, owner of Modern Realty in West Leadville. James, thanks for coming in, mate.
Trent, thank you for having me.
I wanted to get you in because you've got a lot of energy. You're someone who has a very unique story and pathway to real estate in Perth, but also, therefore, a very unique perspective. Us in Western Australia can be boys in the bubble a little bit, having our own context about what things are worth, how things just work generally in property. But one thing we do know is that the market in Sydney, which is where you're from, where you grew up, where you bought, where you were a real estate agent yourself for many years, is very different. Probably more dynamic, a lot more going on. Prices clearly twice as much as ours for the same thing that we're buying, with lower incomes than ours, which just is really hard to compute. So I wanted to get you in just to have some really frank, candid conversations about what's the difference. How is life in property in Sydney different to life in property in Perth, as well as your experience on the ground generally right now in Western Australia, because we always want that update, don't we? So Can you quickly give us a couple of minutes spiel on your background from the first time you were involved in property over in Sydney?
Everything you said there, it's very true. It is in some ways polar opposites comparing the two. However, I guess the general rule is the same. My journey started when I was 17 and my whole family are all lawyers, and I was never interested in that side of life. And our neighbour put their property on the market and I went over and wandered through, and the guy offered me a job randomly. I still finished school, but I did take that job offer and started in property management for about a year. And that was with Rain and Horn back then. And it was a good way to understand the property management side. And it's very hard work. And then from there, basically, I always just had this longing to do sales. And I can't tell you why, but I just love it. So I asked the owners if I could go into sales, and they politely said no about 5 times and kept telling me to go put 50 signboards up for lease everywhere. I ended up just deciding that job wasn't right for me and took a year off and actually drove around Australia and just to explore an adventure. And as I arrived, a friend from school rang me and said, "You've got to go meet the guys at Bressig Whitney." Never heard of Bressig Whitney. I grew up on the North Shore. The only times I went east was probably playing footy. And then I went over and to this office there and sat down for an interview, and it was amazing. The energy, the leadership, and I think when I started there was 16 people, and when I left 10 years later there was 200 odd people there. And to give you an idea, Bressig Whitney was Ivan Bressig, Shannon Whitney, who, along with probably the top agents in Australia, Alex Phillips, Stephen Chen, all those guys who are killing it all around Sydney, all worked under John McGrath.
And McGrath being quite a notable real estate agency, 100%. ASX listed, I believe, as well.
Yep, they are, I think. And John McGrath is stemmed to probably the top in Sydney anyway, top agents there, all worked there. Shannon, he was the number one in that inner east market there, and Ivan was younger then. They started this business. Shannon always had a big vision, and he did change the real estate industry in Sydney, starting with putting price guides on all properties, which in 2003 is unheard of. There was never a price guide on a property.
Which is a bit strange in Perth.
It is.
You only don't see price guides when it's a seller's market, but in a buyer's market, you certainly do see price guides.
100%. Interesting statistic, 72% of people won't click on a property without an advertised guide. Realestate.com. There's an argument each side. Pretty much all my properties, except for something unique, have a guide on for a reason. And if you're a buyer, there's nothing more frustrating than not seeing one. But anyway, that's another topic for another conversation.
Even more frustrating is not being told one when you speak to the agent.
Yeah, and I was in an appraisal, and that owner didn't get someone in because they wouldn't provide a guide on a property, and he just said, anyway, yeah, as I said, that's another whole long conversation, but with just back to, I think, the Bressig Whitney side to sum that up for you. In that time, they really focused on their marketing. They went from no market share to 100% market share, opened up 4 agencies. I was there for 10 years, and then they started doing things, and they still do. If you go on the website, you can download a building inspection on the spot for free. You can get the contract on the spot. It's helping buyers to have a good journey in real estate, which I think Sydney Sydney is definitely leading the runway there.
It's making it as easy as possible to buy a property.
100%, which why make it harder? It's a good system. It still is. A lot of agencies around, they're all competing saying this is stupid, this doesn't work. But in the end, they took over to the point where obviously since then, agents have left. Bressig Whitney is still huge, but there's a lot of the veins of Bressig Whitney running through all of Sydney. And so after about 10 years, I left, and one of the directors, Peter, and I started up a Ray White in the inner eastern suburbs in Sydney. And
so what sort of suburbs are they in the inner east suburbs?
We had an office on Oxford Street in Darlinghurst on the border of Paddington, but I loved the beach and lived in Coogee and basically organically sold a lot around there. We started that business, which is still running today, and we were selling between 10 and 15 properties a month as a team, and we were all around Sydney, from Coogee, Bondi, Darlinghurst, Inner West, covered quite a broad area, but definitely focused eastern suburbs.
So you obviously went throughout that journey over the next 10, 15 years, saw prices rise and rise and rise. Tell us that experience of, I guess, most people going, oh, next year it'll drop or it will stabilise or it can't keep going. What has been that dynamic on the ground for both professionals but also for owners and investors?
So we managed around 750 properties, but a lot were investors who owned multiple properties in the eastern suburbs, and you'd always catch up with them and the conversation was always the same. I'm selling this property because I think the market's going to slow down. I'm selling a property because of this or that. Everyone at some point thought the market would slow down, and yes, it did slow down, but as a general rule, over the 17 years I was selling in Sydney, it only went up. Apart from a few suburbs and a few years, it was an amazing thing to see, where I feel as though you almost couldn't go wrong. All my friends' parents who owned, all they had to do was own a property anywhere in Sydney, and it's gone up 600-700% since we were at school in many cases, sometimes more.
And that really is better than anyone could ever imagine making as an income, making on the stock market. It has created this generational wealth.
Huge.
Not only for obviously our parents' age people, but also for people our age who have been able to use that equity, and often is the only way by using that equity in Bank of Mum and Dad guarantors to buy their own property. Is that the reality over there at the moment when it comes to regular people in their 30s, 40s, probably not in their 20s,
true,
who have been trying to buy their family home over there for a few years? We think about Perth and how it's getting harder for an individual on $100,000 to buy a first homeowner's level property. But you think about Sydney, that seems to have probably not been an option for a long time unless you've got your parents' equity.
If you're earning $100,000 in Sydney, you're not buying a property. If I look at people I know, my age, like late 30s, anyone who bought a property back then was probably a bit easier. In their 20s, has done very well for themselves. And I have a lot of friends on very good incomes who didn't buy, or they did buy, but in their 30s.
Yeah.
And they might be on double or triple the income of the other people who bought in their 20s, but unfortunately, they're behind the 8-ball. And if they've bought an apartment, try and buy a house now. But those people who did the very Sydney thing, buying in their late 20s a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, selling that for a terrace, and then having a family and buying a house, they're the ones who have done by far the best.
And it's interesting, I've noticed the same thing just over the last 5 years really with my friendship group, that there are people who bought in 5-6 years ago and seen a 70-80% increase in the value of their property, and that might have been $300,000-$400,000, not $1-2 million in Sydney reference, but there are a few guys who make probably double their income who are unfortunately $300,000-$500,000 behind now because they didn't make that purchase 5-6 years ago. And it's funny how you can have a great job, great income, but if you didn't make the house purchase back before COVID, essentially, you are struggling to catch up with people who aren't as well-to-do as you, maybe, if you were comparing yourself.
Absolutely.
And I guess you see that really exacerbated in Sydney's culture.
To an extreme.
Haves and have-nots are really just people who owned property versus who didn't.
Yeah. Even working at Bressig Whitney, where there's multiple multi-million-dollar agents, you could say, but a lot of agents writing $1 million, right? Those guys who were smart, bought a property and started that path in life have all done extraordinarily well because of that.
Just because they were in property.
Because they were in, and as a lot of people get sucked into, there are other agents who are buying the watches and the cars and not buying a house, or maybe buying a studio apartment or something like that. They would be earning higher numbers. The people who were smart with their money and invested in property have doubled, tripled in that time.
Yeah. It's really interesting just to see the exacerbated example over in Sydney.
Yeah.
And I guess it's led to this culture there, which we think is quite poignant and quite strong here, but is just 10x over there, where for many reasons, but obviously just the continual growth in the Sydney market has created this culture of, I'm a property investor, I'm a really smart guy, I'm worth a lot of money just from having a few properties, but also this desperation from all those people who haven't trying to get into the market. What was the dynamic like at the negotiation table, auction days, all those sort of things over in Sydney?
So our auction campaigns in a normal market would be 4 weeks. So 3 Saturdays, auction on the 4th. In a really good market, 2 or 3 weeks. Clearance rates where we were generally sitting around 80%. In the eastern suburbs, to be fair, a lot of the time it was 90%. It was really high always. That's where the biggest difference, I think, between Perth and Sydney would be the auction method.
So you send most things to auction over there?
Honestly, 90% of properties would go to auction.
So what's the reason?
Okay, let's look at it logically for a second and go, you've got buyers competing openly with each other in an open forum. You can see who you're competing against. There's no smokes and mirrors. You've got an owner who can understand market value by seeing it. In front of you, you have 3, 4, 5 buyers competing to the point where there's one buyer who is above all the rest. As an owner, whether they're selling or not, you can't argue that is market value at that time, as opposed to negotiating and playing the game, which it can be. The auction process, I can understand why people in Perth hate it, and I'm not telling people in Perth to do it at all. I just grew up doing it in Sydney, and that's why I think even in Sydney, not everyone loves an auction, especially buyers, right? But the reason buyers don't like it is because they feel like they're going to overpay.
They're not in control. But the thing about auctions is you actually know if you're overpaying or not because you have that full visibility. You can
100%.
spend $1 more than the second
Correct.
offer and you know that you've done well there. But it also is very obvious that in an auction process where you don't have opportunities as a buyer to get in quickly, have better terms, all that sort of stuff.
But you do.
In an auction?
Yeah.
You can't get in on the first day and go, how I'll just buy it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, most properties sold before auction.
Oh, there you go. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. It's the truth that a lot of properties, when they're selling before auction, either have one buyer and there's a reason they're doing the deal. They've got someone who is just adamant they're not going to go, because you can offer any time. An agent can't stop you putting an offer forward, right? So you can go to the office, present a 66W and a contract, which waives the cooling off period, 10% deposit, and give it to the agent, and they have to give that to the owner, right? So some agents say they're not going to present offers, but you're supposed to, right? I would say a 90% clearance rate at auctions, probably half are selling before auction, and the other half are going to auction, in my market anyway. The buyers still had an ability to buy it at any time, especially if they were scared of going to auction. And to be fair, sometimes that created an environment where it made it easier, because if you had 10 buyers, you run it to auction, and if you didn't, and the buyer really wanted to buy it, normally they'd want to put an offer in, and they would, and you just negotiate and do the deal.
That's interesting. It creates probably even more fervour there, because as a buyer on the streets trying to do your full-time job and then track 10 houses going to auction every Saturday or Sunday, not only do you have to have your weekends full, but you also have to be getting in early on day one, not auction day 4 weeks later, and making sure that property doesn't get pulled from you on the first week from an owner who accepts an early offer. So you're putting an early offer in, getting rejected maybe, and then being told to wait 2-3 weeks later for auction day as well. It'd be so time consuming as a buyer to try and buy a property over there compared to even here.
I guess the difference is if you have a guide of $2 million, right, and someone offers 2.2 and the owners don't take it, you have to adjust your guide to 2.2. So there are benefits in it. That can push other buyers in the wrong price point away, which is better for the buyers because they know it's out of their budget. But I don't really see the difference between that and there was a property that sold on the weekend where they had the open on Saturday. They sold it on Sunday morning. I knew 4 buyers who were interested in that property, would have paid more. The agent just took the offer and sold it. What would be more frustrating for me would be that situation where you haven't even had an opportunity, and that's on the agent, to be fair, not on the market or anything else, or an auction campaign. They've gone and just sold it to, and I see this in Perth sometimes.
It happens a lot when you've got lazy agents who are just happy to churn.
100% it does.
And they'll essentially just go to the first opportunity that comes their way that the seller is happy with. Approved, gone, here's my money.
Yeah, and I will say to owners all the time, don't expect to sell it on the first weekend, because you need to call your buyers back, you need to get the feedback for the owner, all the rest, and that owner probably lost $150,000 and paid that agent $40,000 to sell the property for less than it was worth. So back to the auction, the question you had then is, yes, it's frustrating if you've got 10 auctions, but what's the difference between having 10 auctions and having 10 properties for sale, not knowing when they're going to sell, agent not giving clarity on offers coming in, not knowing where the offers are at? Because at an auction, at least you can see where the highest offer has been.
I guess it's like a set date sale in Perth in a certain way in terms of how long you're waiting. So you make a good point. Price, you've essentially done really well over in Sydney as an agent, and I would expect your commission keeps going up because it's just 2% or then whatever number you're charging over there of the purchase price. So everyone's winning all the time. A whole culture of everyone just winning as long as they're a part of it. And naysayers on the side being proven wrong year after year. and then you've decided to pull up stumps and move to Perth. Why?
Okay, my wife is from Perth, originally England, but moved to Perth when she was young. I'm a surfer when I have time, which is not very often, but I used to come to Perth all the time for no reason, just I loved it. And when I was running that business in Sydney, I actually was looking to buy an investment over here, made a few calls, didn't really hear back, wasn't getting much feedback, and I was like, this seems like quite a different process. And we have 2 boys and just the lifestyle Perth offers, and I saw a really good opportunity in the real estate sector, I guess you could say, the being an agent over here.
Probably
and
also the market as well, given prices a few years ago.
I was studying them. I love real estate, always have. I probably, like you, read it when I wake up and in the evenings too. I just love following trends and all the rest. And I saw Perth had probably a really great path ahead of it for a while. Sydney was also a bit up and down at that time. And I look at the lifestyle and I look at the opportunity and I thought, I've had a lot of fun in Sydney. My family still probably want to kill me to this day. We're all very close, but jumped over, sold out of the business, moved over here. And now I guess this business is probably growing faster than I thought, but loving it. But yeah, I think that to answer your question, great for the kids, beautiful place to live. Lower cost of living. People used to always go to Sydney. Now then they started going to Surfers Paradise in Brisbane. A lot of properties I'm selling now are Melbourne, Sydney, and now international too, obviously. I'm not saying this is good or bad. Obviously, everyone's got an opinion, but the fact is the lifestyle, the weather, Perth offers is 10 out of 10. And that's probably, to answer your question, simply work, saw a huge opportunity, family, saw a great lifestyle, and cheaper in real estate terms, that's for sure.
You think about cost of living, obviously it's not just the coffees, it's also just the mortgage, right?
Yeah.
Rates, all those sort of things of the value of the property. So you've come over, you've purchased a property in
Scarborough.
Yep.
I always thought Scarborough was an underrated suburb, like Coogee in Sydney, where we bought back in the day. And I think Scarborough, especially South Scarborough, and I guess anywhere outside of the exact immediate hub of Scarborough, I just thought it was a really good opportunity. I was looking at it on maps, looking compared to where I wanted to buy.
So what would you expect to be paying for the equivalent place in Coogee, for example?
2 streets back from the beach, 450 square metres of land, honestly, in a nice house, $6 million.
And what do you pay?
When I bought it too. Yeah.
So you're looking at it as a Sydney person, scratching your head going, what's wrong with this place? How is this just $2 million? And when
or was a high-fiving going, how good is this?
Yeah, that too, right?
Yeah.
But also, can we talk to the psychology for a second?
Yeah.
Where you've come from those dollars being normalised every day, coming to $2 million in Perth for what looks like the same thing, same lifestyle. Are you super sensitive to whether it's 2, 205, 21, 22, or you just, hey, it's less than 4, it's less than 3, who gives a whatever?
Yeah.
I'll have it.
Yeah.
I'll have 2 if I can afford it. Or are you, nah, man, I'm screwing this down as cheap as I can. Like, what's the psychology coming from Sydney where it would be like for a Perth person going to Bali, I think, when it comes to price points?
That's probably fair. Everything is relative, right? So you look at, WA, highest average incomes in Australia for a major capital city, lowest average house prices, right? Not including Darwin and other areas like that. But I think the biggest difference is in Sydney, everyone seemed to borrow, I think the average is like 92% of what they could be offered from a bank. And that was normal. One thing I learned really quickly over here is people, a lot of the time it's going to 60%. You can get a loan of $1 million and they're not right now, but back then we'll spend 600. Now I feel maybe it was you can get a loan for $1 million, and a lot of people are doing kind of 80+%. But I think that's only changed recently with such growth in the market where people are really finding it hard to buy now and to move up in the market. So the biggest difference for me was probably just the Sydney, people just go balls in, literally property, right? Everything's property. Over here, it's a good lifestyle. There's a lot more, to be fair, a lot more people spending $100,000 on a 4-wheel drive and living a good lifestyle and outdoors lifestyle and spending money on toys and things like that, the jet skis, boats, all the rest. Where in Sydney, honestly, people just put their money into real estate.
They have a $6 million house with a bunky $5,000 car because that's all you can afford.
Maybe not a $5,000 car, but yeah. And you have to remember, we're talking the eastern suburbs here, but even North Shore and Northern Beaches are still, that same house in the Northern Beaches is probably 3 or 4 million. And
you go out to the urban fringes and you think about somewhere in Perth now, you're spending $700,000-$800,000 for a property that was $300,000-$400,000 only 5 years ago. But that same property in Mount Druitt, out in Blacktown, these sort of areas, what are you paying for your standard house and land package over there?
$1 million probably won't get you a house in Mount Druitt. $1 million doesn't really get you anything in Sydney. And when you look at average house prices and the market movements, when they're saying Sydney's gone up 0.3%, most of Sydney's gone down, but it's just all those outer fringe suburbs that are actually still going up because that's the only place people can afford.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where the entry level is.
Correct.
Everyone else is just trading, essentially.
Absolutely.
So let's go back to that dynamic in Perth. We obviously don't see auctions.
Yeah. Starting to see them.
A little bit as markets start to get hotter in
Correct.
Perth, and we really only see it when houses would sell themselves in Perth, they go to auction. When you were first over here and you were asking the questions of why to buyers and sellers and colleagues, what were the answers you were getting as to why we don't do auctions here? Was it simply the cooling off period, or was there more of a cultural pushback?
So cooling off periods don't exist really in the eastern suburbs and probably a lot of the North Shore, right?
Because they just waive them?
You waive them. So I would have sold, let's just give an example of a company selling 500 properties a year in the eastern suburbs. You probably do maybe 50 at cooling off periods. In a really bad market, maybe 150, right? But it's 10% maybe. It's just not the norm, right? So in Sydney, if you go to buy a property, you need to pretty much have your 10% deposit ready to go, 5 or 10%. You don't get to pick your deposit. So it's 5 or 10%. You waive your cooling off period, and you just basically need to have pre-approval. So if you're going to auction or whatever it is, you're the highest bidder, you sign the contract, and that's done. You're unconditional. You pull out of that, you lose at $2 million, you're losing 200 grand, right?
Have you seen it?
Yeah, many times. Coming over here, for me, there was so much more power on a buyer to be able to just...
Well, a finance clause means nothing these days. You can get your mortgage broker to just write a letter to say, yeah, you can't get it anymore.
Correct.
And that's all good. 5 years ago, you would need a rigid letter from a bank to get out of the finance clause.
Yeah, and so let's go a step further on that. Owner has to sell their property. On day 20, you get a letter from an email just saying, sorry, finance not approved or something. And that's 3 weeks of a campaign you've lost, starting from scratch again. Now, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying these are the facts. It doesn't give certainty, and the building reports being done post-sale, everyone's used to doing that here. I'm a believer that people should do it beforehand, or even an owner or an agent should get the owner to do one in advance.
I agree with you. I think we as selling agents,
Yeah.
not that I've ever been one, but selling agents should all be organising building inspections up
Absolutely.
front. Just, again, take away one of the risks
100%.
of it.
And we spend we've got a couple of awesome agents working here. I've got a few guys and they're amazing. And just seeing the day-to-day things you have to deal with where building inspections done, there's this, there's that on it. These are all things that shouldn't happen post-sale. It should be something that's dealt with in advance. And I know this is the system that people are used to here, but in Sydney, you've got a standard contract. So the building inspection's done, the property's sold. Any changes to that contract are done obviously, and then the lawyer/conveyancer does that, right? And I think they charge the same fee as settlement agents do here, right? So it's all done by the time the property's exchanged. So then exchange to settlement is really just formalities, right? Over here, it's like you exchange a property and it's just cool. This isn't even near done until building a pest is done, finance is approved, whatever the terms are. I also find it's interesting how an agent can just write any terms up they want to with no legal backing or anything else. An owner says this, they can just write it in.
Just fly off the seat of the pants. Yeah.
Whatever they want to do, right? Now, the only thing is especially if you're a younger agent, you don't understand that could come back to haunt you pretty badly. And you see this with buyers agents, all the rest, writing up terms. And I've heard some horror stories, and I think there's a lot of things that could be smoothed out there where you just don't have those issues in Sydney. Yeah.
So auctions?
I just know how much Perth hates auctions. I understand why they don't like them.
I think it's because buyers often, as you said before, are that much more in control of the transaction and the way it's going to get done if I'm going to give you this price.
Yeah.
There is more of a say from the buyers as a community where you see an auction and you go, nah, I can't be bothered. I'm not going to that. Even if you like the property, because I am not going through that BS to buy a house, even if it's exactly what I want. Not going to be partaking in that crap, thanks. I feel like that is certainly that's my mentality.
Yeah, but let me ask you a question, right? So this is going to sound really weird. I would prefer to buy a property at auction than any other method, right? So if I'm at auction, I'm looking at you right now and you're bidding against me. Now, if I'm the highest bidder, I know that I paid market value. When I bought my property, one, I would have paid more for it, and two, not the one I just bought, like one back in the day, there wasn't the ability for the agent to get the best price. But at the same time, everyone over here, there's so many different ways of selling a property that when a buyer goes from one to the next, so you're doing, is it set date sale, or is it just best and final, or is it selling in the next hour? Everyone's got their own way of doing it, right? And that causes confusion for buyers. My whole thing here is I think it should be easier for buyers to actually buy, but there's things we can do to stop that post-sale headache, right? So going back to what we're just talking about in regards to the auction, here there's too many different ways of doing it. Everyone just does whichever way they want to do it. Put a price guide on, don't put a price guide on. Give no price guide at all. If I'm going to buy, you're bidding against me, I'm looking at you, it's $1 million property, you bid to $990, I bid to $1 million. I'm happy that I know that I legitimately bought that for the market value. If it's smokes and mirrors and you can't see what another buyer's paying or offering on the property, I meet people every single day who would have paid more for a property but didn't get the opportunity. You don't have that problem at auction. The buyers miss out for that reason.
So I think my thought process on auctions there is that the last thing that a seller wants to do when going to auction is put their cards down on the table when playing blackjack, because if no one's going to rock up to that auction, or very few people, you've already shown those people who are at the auction there's not a lot of competition here. So one, you want to be really sure that you're going to get a lot of people coming to this auction, because your house will sell itself regardless of the method or the agent.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
Now, the secondary part of that is, if I'm a buyer, I'd rather the opportunity to feel like I'm being a bit of a smarty pants, get in early, find a way to use terms to feel like I've got a better price. That's essentially how buyer's agents sell their services in Western Australia. Whereas in the East Coast, they're more just like sourcing agents rather than buyer's agents. They're not negotiating shit.
Yes,
right?
Agreed.
You take that away from a buyer, straight away they're going, well, no, I want to buy a property where I feel like I've got a little bit of a win.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to get that at auction because I'm going to be proven that I was the mug who paid the most. Whereas if I go through private treaty, maybe there's a way where I got this for a bit less because I was quicker, the agent liked me more, I had better terms, whatever it is. And so that culture of buying in Western Australia, I think, leads the way of why we don't have auctions, because sellers time and time again, even for nice properties and nice areas, have been reinforced that, sorry dude, one guy rocked up.
And I think that's a sign of the time. So right now it's all good to say, yes, auction works. Perth has gone through a hell of a time where one day your property is worth $1 million and 2 weeks later it's worth 800. You don't see that many places, right? And not only that, 100 people turn up on one weekend and in 2 weeks the market's changed and no one's turning up to the same property, where you don't see that in other markets. You look at auction markets around Australia when the market's really slow and they learn how to master it to get them sold, right?
Let's move to your views on Perth's market right now, what you're seeing on the ground as a bona fide, respectable, respected agent, someone who I find is very dynamic, as you can hear on the podcast for everyone listening. What's going on at your negotiation tables right now? What sort of stuff is selling really well? Is there anything that is surprising you that's not selling as well, and why?
I've always thought Subiaco, for instance, is a suburb where it's been undervalued, right? Just because of a lot of reasons. And so what I'm seeing at the moment is, let's talk broadly here, it's the downsizer market. And this is why I'm talking about Subiaco too. I've sold quite a few this year around there for $2 to $3 million, where they're happy, they've got a great price for their property. But James, I need single level or a lift, because we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. And they're like, my house was worth 1.5 last year. I just sold it for 2.5. Let's go buy something. Now they go looking and there's nothing. There's crickets. And if they find a single level property, they're competing with a bunch of young families. And if they find a suitable property with a lift, it's sold in 20 seconds.
Ironically, these are the same people who are voting against the local infill project going on in the street next door 3 or 4 years ago. This is the frustration of property developers, and especially in those western suburb areas.
Yeah, but that's also, I think, the mentality, because you look at every other capital city, there's high rises in core areas, and there are options for people to buy a beautiful apartment to live in, to downsize. Perth was always the place you want 1,000 square meters, a big house, all the rest, and you could get it for a long time. But the problem is everyone for a long time downsized to 400 square meters, but now people don't want to look after a house. They want to go to their beach house. They want to lock and leave, but people don't want stairs either. If I asked my mum and dad 10 years ago, hey, you'll be in an apartment in 10 years, they would look at me and they'd laugh. Now, they bought a 3-bedroom apartment 3 years ago. I sold the house for them quite a while ago. They've never been happier. They've got the beach property they go to, and
therein is the transition of modern society, where people are moving to more urban environments because they want the activity.
Ease of living.
There's only one way to do it, especially with costs, and that is apartments.
Correct.
For older people, townhouses for younger people.
Also townhouses with lifts for older people too.
True.
And that's smart. We see Netherlands, they've got a few coming into lifts now. So to go back to the question of the market, everything I'm selling at the moment where either a young family or a downsizer could live in it, hotly contested. You're looking at square metre rates going, not Sydney, but not far off for some of them. And this is where I think developers are itching to build these kind of properties. They're not able to at the moment. I'm not going to get political and say whether I think it's a great idea or a bad idea. All I know is there's a major shortage of it. I think in these key suburbs where people will sell their house for $3, $4, $5, $6 million, they want the option to live in that same area. But all these suburbs have you've got Subi 1, which is a good example. There's a reason that's gone up so much, because it is a good option, or probably the best option for them to live in the area, but there's not really many other options.
Or you've got Elysium, good example at the top of Rockaby there.
Correct.
But there really needs to be like 10 Elysiums.
Yeah, to capture that market. Yeah. And it's going to be a big problem because people don't want to move right out of the area. They want to stay in the area. So look at Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, all those core markets, they've all got, whether it's on the train line or wherever, they've got some nice high rises that work aesthetically to that market and all the rest, and they're popular for a reason. Yeah.
What's not working? Anything that you're finding is a reason why something isn't selling in the first couple of weeks? Is it a property type? Is it a seller expectation? Is it a location?
Building costs. Land is definitely not as easy to shift in, not around here. I'm talking further afield. There's Midlands, those areas, you can still buy 1,500 square metres for 600,000. Why? Because you can't build apartments at the moment. Bassendean, areas like that, you can still go buy a triple block for $1.5 million where you could build 150 apartments on it, but no one's buying it. Try and find that in another capital city. You can't, because you can build and you can make money on it. So that's probably the one tricky market at the moment. I'm also seeing still that whole anything on a busy road, or, what people love at the moment, they want a shed. If they can get a shed, people don't like not having a garage here. There's definitely a few key ingredients, maybe you could say, but if it's not there, that buyers are definitely a bit more hesitant. And also, everyone's saying the market is phenomenal, but to be fair, with that market comes heightened vendor expectations. And if you don't manage them, there's a lot of properties out there, good properties, that haven't sold still.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I've noticed that as well, that there are properties that you look at and go, oh, it's interesting, didn't get that many people to the home open.
Correct.
Great location, great property.
Yeah.
But then I look at the price and I'm scratching my head going,
Yes.
That's a lot. And I can only put it down to that, James. Is that what it is? Is that
it is.
Sellers are pricing themselves out? My advice to everyone who's got those beautiful properties, or even just normal properties, to be honest, that nothing special, just price it fairly. Give it a price,
Absolutely.
give it a range, and
100%.
make it fair, not top end. And I remember agents a long time would say, price them low, watch them grow. That's not
Price
exactly...
them high, watch them die.
Yeah, that's what it is. And I think at the end
Old
of the
school.
Mortgage price it fair, and we actually see it growing quite a lot. But you show an arrogance as a seller in this market, and you have the buyer pool just putting their two middle fingers up, going, even if I like this property, I'm not coming. In the same way they will to auctions.
I agree, and I've seen it firsthand. Had a couple sell in the last week, which we definitely had to work on expectations. But once it was done, they were really happy. Especially around here, there are some really good houses on the market. And even Cottesloe is a good example, where what was 3 is now, they're asking 5 in the space of a year. And they're not all selling. But everyone's sitting there going, Cottesloe's gone crazy. But the apartments have. Because why have they? Because people like the downsizers are buying them. There are a lot of properties that are still not. Well, when I say a lot, there's some good properties still not selling, but it only comes down to, I would say, vendor expectations, which will be inflated. And I've seen that for 20 years in Sydney when prices never went down.
Yeah, how did that compare in Sydney? Do you have similar dynamics where you've got these overzealous sellers and a little bit of pushback in certain times of the cycle going forward? What was the outcome there with regards to that dynamic? Or was it this ravenous acceptance of whatever the price is, I'll pay what I have to because there's always 10 more people?
Yeah, and look, in Sydney, it's not all roses. I've had auctions where no one's turned up. I've had lots of them. I've probably sold 25% of properties with one buyer, but they're still sold. But talking about vendors and heightened expectations, a lot of it comes down to motivation. A lot of it comes down to experience. And you need to be able to justify that as an agent and show them recent sales. If an owner says, I want 2 million, and I'm seeing that at the moment, and the agent just goes, yes, because the market's good. But the comparable's 1.7, and then all of a sudden no one's turning up to an open home. Yeah. In Sydney... you've
got the auction process for starters, which would be evidence.
Yeah,
but I guess if you have a reserve that's way above what people want to pay, is that where as an agent you're in there in the room going, Gladys, you got 20 offers here, but they're all 10% lower than your reserve. This is what it is. Is that your opportunity there to condition a seller?
Absolutely, from day one. And Gladys will soon see, because you've got expectations of $1 million, and either the auction stopped at 900, or a lot of property sells in Sydney the day of auction, but after the auction, because that's just conditioning the seller. And the auction's done its job. The buyer's still there. You go back and forth a few times and it gets done. In saying that, in the Sydney market, generally it's those people who have bought and sold before who would be happy to meet the market. We've all had those owners who just don't listen for whatever reason. Sydney does have their fair share, but I think because Sydney's so real estate based, everything is real estate in Sydney. And on top of that, the agents are very good. They're not afraid to tell an owner what it's worth. Their vendor management, things like that, is day to day. In doing it for 17 years there, you do it every day. But over here, there are agents who've only been doing it for 3 years, so they've never seen a bad market before, because they haven't. The market's been not amazing, but it's been consistent for quite a few years. How are they going to handle it when all of a sudden no one's turning up to an open, or things like that? So I guess it's all experience from the agent to help those vendors make that transition. But yeah, Sydney, I hate to say it, but yes, a lot of the time your mum could put a signboard up the front, do 4 open homes and sell it at auction. It's when the market slowed down a bit that the skills really came out.
Well, it'll be interesting, because I don't expect we're going to see that market for at least the next year or two in Perth, but it will be one that's more egalitarian, I think, at the end of the day. Good agents will be selling the best properties for the best prices. Good houses will sell well.
Yeah.
Dodgy places or places that are overpriced in dodgy areas won't get the same love, the same FOMO as we saw with the East Coast investor-induced furor in the last couple of years. We're going to see growth based on amenity, as I've been saying for the last few months of this year.
Gentrifications. Look at Redfern
exactly
in Sydney.
right.
Do you know Redfern?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. When I started, there was fires in the street. Literally, the back fences of properties had glass in the cement, and a house you could buy for $400,000. Redfern, Darlington, but they were always good locations. And when I left, there were houses in Redfern selling for $5-6 million.
I think you see a similar thing in places like Willagee, for example.
Absolutely.
I had friends who live there, and they get their house broken into every few months. Their house 6 years ago would be worth $500,000 on a full block. It's now 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 mil for the same thing. Yeah. And there's been gentrification because of rezoning and a lot of state housing moving out of the area. Coolbellup, similar situation there as well. Hamilton Hill on the south side as well.
Hamilton Hill. Can I give you a really good example? To go back to your first question, right? I still remember when I came over here and I had a house in Waikam Valley. And I still remember sitting there. It was a beautiful home, 500 square meters. And we priced it thinking, okay, it's $800,000, right? And we sold it for $840,000, I think. This is only a couple of years ago. But I still remember, this is when you ask about having Sydney head in the Perth market. That was one example of me sitting there scratching my head going, how the hell is this $840,000? It's beautiful. It's got character. It's close to Fremantle. It's walking distance. And I guess, to be fair, I guess we were right, because that property in 2 years is probably worth 1.3 now. I still look at the suburbs like Hamilton Hill and those areas. Look at the location. Yes, the prices seem scary now, but there's a reason they're moving, because it's a livability.
Yeah, it's walk score, it's amenity, it's how long do I have to drive to work. It's all those sort of things, to water, to the city. So I think those are always the fundamentals, whether you look at a suburb and think, oh, it's dodgy or not. Yeah. Eventually they will shine through, because eventually enough people with good character and good backgrounds will fill those areas as a spillover from the areas that are already nice. Yeah. Amenity will always shine through, and that is mostly location.
Yeah, and Sydney's done that. Melbourne's done that to an extent. Brisbane's done that. Perth hasn't yet. It's starting to.
I think you can look at suburbs like Yanola is starting to come out from there. It will be Westminster and Balga next, and eventually these are suburbs where people go, come on, Trent. Yeah. Those places are holes. But actually, when you look at the location, the amenity, closeness to city, closeness to water, they're not trig. Yeah. But they're certainly not X% less in terms of value and amenities for most people. And it will be as more people who are brought up in nicer areas who can't afford those nicer areas anymore. Young guys who are having to move to those areas as compromisers fill the suburb up, and they go, hey, this is all I can afford. And eventually you've got a suburb of people who grew up in Duncraig living in Balga.
And they've got kids, and
now it's a lovely area.
Cafes on the corner.
Exactly.
When I moved over here, I still remember looking at Glendalough, Stirling, those areas, and saying to my friends who were trying to buy $800,000 a house somewhere, and they're looking double view, getting priced out. And I was saying to them, guys, you're talking 10 minutes to the city and less, and you're talking 12 minutes to the beach. How can you get a house around $1 million? And even now at the 1.213 million for 700, 800, 900 square meters, I still think it's good value, because you put that in any other capital city that close to the beach or to a hub, they're $2 million easily.
And that's the perspective I wanted to bring today, James. And I really appreciate your time on the chat. And it's that fortitude, that conviction of looking me in the eye and going, I still think this is a good value, because when you're a national buyer, someone who has national perspective on what things cost, what land costs in certain locations close to amenity, that's when you know. And as much as I would consider myself an expert in Perth, I don't have a monkey's clue about what's going on with prices in Sydney and Melbourne, and therefore it's that perspective I think is really important for us in Perth to continually remember as prices continue to go up. It's not a sense of gravity here where what goes up must come down. Absolutely. It only goes down if the arse falls out of the fundamentals, which we know aren't changing for quite a period in time in Perth.
Perth's not a mining town anymore. Perth's
and
amazing.
Therefore it is amenity based. If you have that amenity, if you have that wage, and you're paying the same interest rates as everyone else, population growth continues to grow higher than anyone else, and we are not fixing our supply problem worse than anyone else. What happens to prices in the same way as what happened to prices in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane? It's Perth's renaissance right now, for good or bad. Good for those in the market, as we saw in Sydney. Bad for those who were not.
Correct. Hopefully they get in the
real
market.
Shift. That's right, and that is the real haves and have-nots going forward in Western Australia. It's those who have houses, have property, and those who don't. Don't even worry about your income. Mate, thank you very much for your time.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!